Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about the madness that happened in the old League of Legends. Pour yourself some food and drink, get comfortable, like it, and love your mom. The old League of Legends was a time when Riot Games was a real little indie company with an anime every time the client crashed. League of Legends has been one of the biggest games in the world for over 10 years, and during that time, it seems like there have been two different Leagues of Legends. There's the one we're playing right now, and then there's the one from the early 2010s, which some people still consider the best. Hello, everyone. This is Skiff, and today we're going to talk about the absurdity, the imperfections, and the more interesting aspects of the League of Legends that we can't bring back. Over the years, the League has changed much more than many people realize. Almost every aspect of the game is different from what it used to be. For example, in those old days, there were no changes to the map due to the dragon element. Instead, there were maps that were tied to various in-game events or holidays like Halloween. Personally, I've always liked them, but unfortunately, they've now been replaced by seasonal theme cards. Today, I want to explore different nostalgia, things that once made the game completely different. So, if you want something similar but more detailed about other parts of the game, like and comment on what you'd like to see. This will help me release videos as often as possible. And, just as importantly, to get a feel for the old League of Legends, you can pick up an archive skin during the sale. And when you register using my link, you'll receive a coupon that will give you a discount on your first purchase. Surprising ally. Link in the description. I want to start with 2016 and the Jungler. Many old mechanics weren't necessarily removed from League of Legends entirely. They were often reworked or even became part of the gameplay. A good example of this is the Hunter Potion. It's an item that I, and many others, had completely forgotten about. It was crafted from a refillable potion, was inexpensive, and was somewhat similar in concept to the Harm Potions. It was a useful item for jungle survival, with up to 5 charges that could be restored by killing large monsters. It was only removed midway through Season 9 because Riot season after season made clearing the jungle easier and easier. Now, junglers can survive without such an item because camps are not as difficult as they used to be. And this is a very important difference from the old League. Before, you really had to think about where to start, which camps you could even take, and whether you were capable of clearing the jungle. Back then, there were 2 main starting items for junglers, a talisman or a machete. A talisman provided area of effect damage to camps, while a machete was better for solo camps and junglers whose damage relied on auto attacks. If a champion could start with a talisman, they could easily clear avian camps. Examples of such champions were Amomu, Gikarim, and others. But if you started with a talisman instead of a machete, then the same thunderbolt and buffs gained more slowly, and the first clear wasn't always realistic. Even back then, junglers essentially didn't need a healing item like they had for several years. Smite healed, Thunderbolt healed, and overall there was much more healing available back then than before. Now, jungle play is even easier, and I think many have noticed a parallel between the potion mechanic and the fact that every chem now provides healing after a kill. This is another big pattern in modern League of Legends. Much of what used to require purchasing, choosing, or thinking through is now automatic, as the game has become much simpler and easier to learn. Another good example is Militia, or Home Guard, whichever is more convenient. You know that effect when you respawn or die and gain an extra movement speed boost. It's taken for granted now, but Home Guard wasn't free. It had to be purchased, like a boot enchantment. Boot enchantments are one of the most nostalgic systems from the old League of Legends, reworked and added last season, but essentially cut again this season, leaving it only for mid laners. And going back in time, Home Guard was sometimes rushed first. It sounds pretty strange now, but in 2015, it wasn't all that uncommon. For example, Gikarim, a top laner, would buy Home Guard as early as possible to combo with his teleport, gaining extra mobility and damage immediately afterward. In a way, this boot back then was like a pseudo-teleport or a mini-ult for Quinn. Players had the opportunity to get there faster. And what's funny is, many of these effects haven't disappeared completely. They've simply migrated to other parts of the game. And that's exactly what made the old League of Legends special. Sometimes quirky, sometimes absurd, but very much alive. But it wasn't just the game itself that was strange. There's one thing I don't particularly miss. Because if anyone doesn't remember, the ranked system back then was simply broken. Now, for example, you can queue for the role you want to play. In the old League of Legends, there was no such luxury. Back then, the draft worked like this. Essentially, how early you were picked determined what role you'd play. If you were the last pick, you had no rights whatsoever. You were simply filling the role that no one on your team wanted to take. And yes, today people complain about autophilia, which I basically agree with. I think it shouldn't exist. But back then, autophilia was a way of life. Everyone went through it, and everyone was forced to play with what was left. I think that's precisely what was unbearable. But it also forced you to be able to play all the roles at least somehow. Because in the early seasons of League of Legends, they literally forced you to do it. And that's not all. If you were the first pick, you controlled all the bans on your team. And back then, there were only 3, not 5. Of course, there was an alliance. They would write who they wanted to ban, and you were supposed to respect that. But in practice, the first pick could do absolutely anything he wanted. He wanted to ban Wager. He wanted to ban Alistar. He wanted to ban all the awkward matchups in the mid lane if he was going there himself. The rest had no control over the situation, no say in the matter, and it was absolutely barbaric. Yes, more often than not, people still adhered to some internal etiquette. If you were the first to write a role in chat, it was usually given to you. But in the end, everything was resolved very simply. If I'm higher picked than you, and I think I have more rights, I just pick the champion and play. No role selection, no fairness, just the pure anarchy of the old League of Legends. And since we're talking about what ranks used to be, let's move on to objectives. Let's start, of course, with dragons. Veterans will probably remember the days when a dragon simply gave global gold and nothing more. But the most interesting question is elsewhere. What was the difference between that old version and the modern elemental dragons? In 2015, Riot reworked dragons and made them stackable objectives with bonuses for the team. It seems like everything is the same now, but back then, it was different. Both teams simply tried to take as many dragons as possible, and each kill granted a new effect. The first dragon provided a bonus to CP and AD, essentially something similar to what the Fire Dragon does today. The second dragon increased damage to minions and jungle monsters. The third dragon granted movement speed, not like the current Air Dragon, but simply running speed, regardless of whether you were in combat or not. The fourth dragon increased tower damage, which helped end games faster and was a huge help to split-pusher players. And if the team reached the fifth dragon, they received the then-current version of the Elder Dragon. The bonuses weren't like the modern Elder Dragon, but in essence, it worked almost the same. If a team took the fifth dragon, the match was often already over. This buff really helped close out long games and added another important target to the late game besides Nashor. But the most interesting of the old objects remains the Abyssal Gerald. And in fact, many will be surprised by how much Gerald has changed, although by the standards of the old league, it's not that ancient history. When Gerald was added in patch 5.22 before the start of Season 6, he was completely different from the Herald we know today. Back then, he was more like another dragon-like buff. He granted global gold to the team and a temporary 2-minute buff. This buff provided bonus damage, movement speed, a faster return to base similar to Nashor, and also buffed nearby creeps to make pushing lanes easier. Furthermore, it could be claimed multiple times. It spawned at the 4-minute mark and then spawned every 5 minutes. Sounds good, but in practice, it wasn't the most popular target. The buff itself was okay, but it only lasted 2 minutes, and most players didn't think it was worth the effort. They often had to spend too many resources on it, and the payoff wasn't all that impressive. So, very quickly in Season 6, Wright completely reworked the hero. He only spawned once, but now he provided an insane buff for a full 20 minutes to a single player. Even funnier, this buff didn't disappear upon death. So the situation turned out like this. If you got it at 10 minutes, you could easily run with this buff until minute 30. This buff was tailored for split-pushing duels. Essentially, it was a prototype of the old Bartholomew. If there were no allies nearby, you received walking damage reduction and an attack boost, which also affected structures. If you managed to get the Herald buff, your split-pushing felt incredibly powerful for the next 20 minutes. And some one-on-one fights that you usually wouldn't win suddenly became quite feasible. Back then, playing with such a buff was incredibly fun, and not so much for the opponent. And in fact, for this reason, this mechanic quickly faded. Ultimately, Wright settled on a version of Herald that hasn't changed much since then. It's an important and powerful asset that can be used to push advantages, but it comes with a price. If you trade your second or third dragon for Herald, it's a conscious choice with consequences. If a situation arose where it was necessary to swap the second or third dragon for a Herald, it was always a conscious choice with consequences. And this particular version of the object, in my opinion, looks much better. But the old League of Legends was different not only in its in-game mechanics, it was also different in the number of modes available, and that's also worth discussing. Of course, we had Rift, a standard map for casual and ranked, but, for example, a separate mode like Aram didn't even exist back then. If you wanted to play in a single lane, you had to create a custom lobby, invite friends, or search for people manually. Moreover, there wasn't even a separate map for Aram, so everyone played on the standard Rift and simply hoped that everyone would follow the rules and stay in the mid lane. Sometimes, of course, someone would start trolling, go to the lanes, ruining the entire format, and that was also part of that same old league. At that time, the only full-fledged mode was 3v3, which was eventually removed at the end of Season 9. It was a sad loss because Twisted Treeline had its own unique vibe and was very different from the main game. I didn't spend much time there while it existed as a main mode, but it certainly wasn't worth removing. Twisted Treeline had some significant advantages over the main mode: fewer players, less chaos, a completely different meta, as well as the pace of the game. PvE modes like Odyssey and Star Guardian are also worth mentioning. They were a completely different experience, and it's a shame Riot doesn't bring them back from time to time because they would have been truly interesting. And it's precisely these kinds of things that make up the old League of Legends. It was uneven, it was lopsided, sometimes it was downright unfair, but it also had an insane number of unique mechanics, strange decisions, and moments that still bring a smile to my face. The modern league is certainly more convenient, cleaner, and more understandable, but the old league was often simply more interesting. That's all. This was Scythian. Please like and subscribe. And, as I said, if you'd like me to talk about anything from the old League of Legends, let me know in the comments.